Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a collection of driving and road trip stories that are sure to scare you. I also would like to thank Miss Fearsome for joining us in tonight's video. So grab your steering wheels, get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. And trigger warning for the first story. I recently moved out in the middle of nowhere. I was about 5 minutes away from home when I stopped at a stop sign to look for a lighter in my purse. I noticed a man walking towards my car from the tree line and immediately drove off. It was pretty late at night, and my closest neighbor is about 10 minutes out from where I am. It's all woodland and farms. There's no good reason the man should have been out in the middle of nowhere like that. I picked up my neighbor, who lives a few miles away, who had a couple of young daughters himself, and we went out to look for the man after reporting it to the police. We never found him, but there were footprints all around the tree line. I never got out of the car, but my neighbor, who was properly armed and protected, spent a good 30 minutes searching the area. A few months rolled around, and they found the guy living on private property, along with another man. They had been kidnapping young women for months, and eating them alive / selling them on the black market. They used an abandoned shed as a slaughterhouse and had meat hooks hung everywhere. They found a missing woman naked and locked in a cage, and authorities believed dozens of the missing women cases ended up there. It freaked me out for a while and still does. Being a woman, I'm usually extra careful anyway, but I definitely felt like this was a wake-up call to be extra precautious. I remember getting the Amber Alerts at least once every other week, all with the same description. Long brown hair, around 5'3", blue eyes. I have long brown hair, and 5'2" and have blue eyes. Really creepy. After this happened, I made a point to become very familiar with firearms. I'm originally from Chicago, so that's saying something. Crime in the city is predictable. Crime in the South is straight up out of a horror movie.
So on Christmas Eve night a few years ago, I was driving with my wife and newborn child. We were coming home from visiting a family on my wife's side, having done the whole Christmas gauntlet, and were on the highway with a few cars around us. Just then I noticed that a few cars in front of me had slammed on their brakes. It was weird, because I could see there wasn't any traffic slowing the cars down, and as we got closer to where the cars had braked, I could see a person just standing there on the highway, on the dotted line separating the two lanes. At the last moment, I swerved, missing him by inches, then looked in my rearview mirror to see that the car behind me had stopped suddenly in the road. Having my wife and kid with me, and nowhere safe to stop, I felt I had to keep driving, but we called 911. It turns out that the guy had been pulled over on the other side of the highway, but didn't want to get arrested, so ran onto our side. The car behind me hit him, killed him, and they were transported to the hospital with serious injuries.
I'll start at the beginning of the worst day and a half of my life. Right now I'm a female at 31. At the time this happened, I had just turned 22. I got off work early from my second job. The cool breeze kissing my face, cooling me down as I drove up the long driveway. It was so calming. My husband and I at the time lived on this ranch that we also worked on. It was dark, desolate, and just had a completely different feel at night. The creatures of the night howling and chirping, the shadows of all the trees dancing in the headlights. Then there's our house, smack dab in the middle of it. The forest unraveling around it as far as you can see. I made it to my front porch, and something just felt off. I can't explain it, but I soon found out when I walked in there. They were there, on the couch, completely naked. The next hour was a complete blur of shouting, crying, and him begging me to listen. I just couldn't, not again. This was the end of us. I packed up everything I could in my small black Honda, spiraling gravel into the house, and sped back down the same driveway I had just not too long before been so serenely driving home on. It was about a 4-hour drive back to my dad's house, my safe space. I wanted my dad, reverting back to my 10-year-old self, longing for my dad to fix my proverbial boo-boos. I drove on, determined, into the night, and everything was going smoothly, until I was almost back to my hometown. You see, my gas gauge hadn't worked in a long time, and through the horrible situation I just endured doing laps in my head and had forgotten to fill up before I left. The car started to sputter and cut out in the absolute worst of places possible. I was on a 3-lane highway at 3 in the morning, and the only place to pull my car over was a tiny bike lane butted up to a retaining wall. I was screwed. There was no one on the highway at this time, and if there were, they weren't going to stop for me. I put my hazards on, but that was just a band-aid for the moment. A couple of semis had passed me in the 10 minutes or so that I had become stranded. They barely saw me in time to move over. They passed so close that my entire car shook. It shook so hard that the crack in my front windshield started to spread haphazardly across it. I was scared at this point, and I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, I saw a car on the opposite side of the highway slow down and make an illegal U-turn across 3 desolate lanes. The small SUV pulls up next to my window. In the car were 2 young males in their teens and what looked to be like their young girl companions. The guy driving asked me what happened. I gave them a brief rendition of the story, and he then offered to drive me to the nearest petrol station. I was hesitant at first, but quickly realizing my current situation, I reluctantly obliged. We made it to the parking lot of a Wally World, which I thought was odd. I dare not question it yet. I held onto my purse closely, trying not to draw attention to the nervous sweat beading down my brow. The driver then tells me his friends have somewhere to be, and they all but the driver just exit the car without rhyme or reason, leaving me alone with the young male driver. He tells me that he'll quickly take me to the gas station, and now a small sense of relief comes over me. Then quickly fades. Because I knew this town, I had grown up here, and he was not heading towards any gas station. The young man, which I did not get a name of, suddenly turns down a dark, dimly lit alleyway and just parks the car and says, nonchalantly, "Hey, I just need to park here for a minute and take my insulin," insinuating he's diabetic. It wasn't insulin. It looked dirty. It was drug paraphernalia. I've seen enough cops to know what they look like. At that moment, my heart sank to my buttocks. I said to him, can you just take me back to my car, please? I'll figure it out." He didn't respond. Just then I caught a glimpse of 2 skinny men clumsily trying to duck behind a dumpster behind us in the alley. I was naive enough to bring this up to my unwanted capture. He said in a menacing tone, "I don't know what you're talking about, you're tripping, girl." I instantly went into fight or flight mode. I started telling him my tragic life story, like how my brother had killed himself, and I was all my dad had left. He even tried to shush me. I kept talking, told him about my cheating husband, and the fact that I just wanted to get home and be with my dad. For a moment he paused and looked at me, and then something clicked in his brain. Before I knew it, he was speeding off to the poorly lit alleyway into the scorching lights of the highway and the Walmart across the street. He screeched to a stop in front of my car, threw out my purse and a random half-full gas can from behind his seat, and uttered the words, which I will never forget, that are seared into my brain. "Don't ever get into someone's car you don't know. Now get the hell out of here." And he sped off down the highway, vanishing forever. There are so many things I wish I did differently, but thinking back, I'm alive, and it could have been much worse. I, for one, will never be the same because of it. I service firefighting breathing air compressors, and was on a service call in the northwest of Pennsylvania. I was running a bit late, so it was dark when I left the fire station, as this was in February about 15 years ago. As I drove down this twisty rural two-lane, I passed a Dodge Durango on the side of the road with its headlights on. It wasn't near any houses, just in a wide spot, so I thought maybe they'd broken down or gotten a flat. I slowed down and went behind the Durango to see a shape lying on the ground. I thought it might be a driver trying to get the spare wheel out from under the vehicle, but then I realized it was a man on top of a woman holding her down and apparently trying to strangle her. I had to drive about a quarter of a mile further before I found a spot to turn around. I was in a 16-foot box van, so I couldn't just do a U-turn in the road. I turned around and headed back. The Durango passed me, heading the way I had been going originally. I got to where it had been parked and the woman was lying there in the snow. I thought she might be dead, but as I pulled up she sat up, then shakily got to her feet. She was probably in her 40s, very thin and in a skirt and an inadequate jacket. I asked if she was okay and she just said, "I'm cold." I had to get her into the passenger seat of my truck and cranked up the heat. She sat there shivering, her body hunched forward. She had blood on her face and her fingers were red. She didn't say anything about what had happened. I pulled out my phone and surprisingly had enough signal to call 911. I explained what I'd seen and they dispatched a state trooper. It took 15 minutes for him to get there. The only thing the woman said was, "They're gonna arrest me." I offered her some napkins and water, and she wiped her face off. I didn't want to bother her, since she seemed to be in shock, so we just sat there in silence for a while. The trooper arrived, and she let out a designated sigh, opened the door and said, "Thank you for helping me," and walked over to the trooper. He spoke to her for a few seconds, then had her sit in his car. He came over and I explained what I had seen, and described the Durango. He thanked me and said I could go. A few days later, my phone rang while I was away from it. It was a restricted number, and the voicemail was from the trooper, thanking me again, saying that he may need me to offer some more testimony if I was willing. I never heard back from the police. I never found out what had happened. I think it was either a sex worker or a drug deal that went bad, but I never saw anything about it.
To set the scene, it was about 3 years ago, and my job at the time had me leaving the house at around 4 a.m. in the morning, 5 to 6 days a week, and it was a horrible schedule for me. I hated it. I lived in the middle of nowhere, so I'd frequently see deer on the road, and they'd occasionally jump across the street out of nowhere. The scariest part was when it was extremely foggy outside, and you'd literally not be able to see more than a foot ahead of the road. So one day, I was heading to work, and it was a bit foggy. I'd already spotted several deer, and a few had jumped out, attempting what I can only assume is deer suicide. At this point in my life, I wasn't so much so scared of deer jumping out. I was more angry every time I'd have to drive to work, especially on days like this, thinking of all the financial hardships and stress that might happen if a deer decided to randomly commit deer suicide using my car. As I was driving through the fog, I saw what appeared to be a shadow, or maybe a big stick, I don't know. But as I got closer, it seemed like it was just a big stick, to which I thought, let me run this over and break it in half with my bare tires. As I inched closer to it though, the fog had cleared a little, and I could now see that it was not a big stick at all. It was in fact what appeared to be a gigantic, to me anyway, dead wolf. I quickly swerved to the left, just barely avoiding running it over, and literally almost had a heart attack and even cried a little. The second creepiest, scariest thing that has happened to me, when I was working the same job, maybe 4 months later. I took a different route to work that day, and it turns out that that was a bad idea. I was driving down the road, and again it was a bit foggy. The fog had cleared up a bit, and what did I see? A giant bear in the middle of the road. I freaked out and didn't know what to do, Now again, I live in the middle of nowhere, and the roads, which are the size of one regular-sized city road, but for some reason is a road for two-way traffic, was very narrow, and there is literally nowhere to really turn. It's just ditches on either side. Suddenly, this bear roared at me and started charging towards me. I got going, fast and furious on this bear, although it was more like the flight of fight or flight, and very fearful, and I put my car into reverse. I stepped on the gas and somehow navigated my way through the fog whilst going full speed in reverse. I did a full 180 and drove off the other way with no idea where I was going. After about a couple of minutes, I turned my GPS on and found another way to get to work.
When I was 20, I used to go driving around a lot at night. One time I was doing my usual drive around to no particular destination when I decided to go down this dirt road in the middle of nowhere in South Georgia. There was a cotton field on the right side and woods along the left side. It was like this for miles. Shortly after driving along the road for about a mile or two, I noticed something hanging from a branch along the wood line. This branch stretched all the way across the road, nearly reaching the cotton field. What was hanging from this branch is stuck in my mind, even years later. It was a deer, but not just any deer. This deer had been mutilated. It was hanging from its antlers by what looked like towing straps. It also looked as though it had been beaten with blunt objects. Its body was filled with deep lacerations, and it was also nearly split in half horizontally. Its lower half was barely hanging by a thread. Still to this day, I have no idea what it was doing there like that.
So one night, I was driving home from a party, and it was about 3 a.m. in December of a year in the early 1990s. I was on a long rural road with fields either side of me, and it was pitch black. I'd gotten to about 3 miles from anywhere when I saw the eyes of a dog in my headlights. It was just sitting by the side of the road. I slowed down for it, but then realized there was a man's body lying next to it on the ground. Now this was pre-mobile phones, and there was no way in hell I was stopping as a 23-year-old woman on my own. So I drove as fast as I could home and called the police. They phoned me back the next day, as the man wanted for them to thank me. He'd been at the pub with his dog, was nearly home, and he had collapsed. It turned out that he was diabetic, and the alcohol had had some sort of effect on him, which I'm not sure of the details of, but he'd been there for hours, and no one had noticed him. He was close to hypothermia when the police found him, so they of course called an ambulance and took him to hospital. His dog was a good boy, and 10 out of 10 for just staying with him. I wouldn't have seen him at all if it hadn't been for his dog.
This happened about a year or two ago. I'm in the Alabama Air Force National Guard, but I work in a city in Florida. I'm traveling home for the weekend late on Friday night, since I had to be at my unit the next morning. I have drill once a month. I have been traveling for a while, and I am on a highway in Alabama near my parents' house. It's about 9 p.m, and there are no lights to light up the street. It's pitch dark, when I see a car stop at a stop sign about 60 to 70 yards in front of me, and he goes across the street I'm driving on. Mind you, it's dark and the car had his headlights on. When I go to the street he crosses, and I look down the street he went down, and there was no street, no cars, no lights, nothing. There was only grass and a telephone pole. I would have seen the red backlights at least, as I was going too fast for him to disappear before I got to him. I got out of there as fast as I could, and to this day I still cannot explain exactly what happened.
My niece had a creepy experience once as she drove past the area of the church and graveyard where my father was buried. She'd suddenly heard his voice clearly urging her to pull over. Rattled, she heard it again, her grandpa's voice telling her to pull over. So she did so, and just then a car came flying by on the wrong side of the road, and she'd avoided a head-on collision. She was his favourite grandchild.
I went on a cross-country RV trip this past spring with my friend Melissa and her 7 kids and 2 young German shepherds starting in West Virginia, in a 20-year-old RV christened Big Betsy, and almost everything that could go wrong did. Among other things, the water lines broke the night before we had to go, so we relied on jugs for the entirety of the trip. The gas tank cap was busted, so it was a hell of a job to get it off. Tires had good tread, but a couple were pretty old, so they worried me. We found out the auxiliary batteries sucked, so we needed to jump-start them with a power supply every time we stopped. The main battery cable had a bad connection, so every time we started the engine, I had to stand in front and jiggle the cables while she turned the key. The slide jammed, and we had to get a pry bar to get in and out of it. Driving through Colorado Springs, we blew a spark plug out and had to stop for repairs. Luckily, her brother, who used to be a diesel mechanic, was traveling with us, and only took a day to fix it. Regardless, we were still having a great time, seeing the scenery, stopping at landmarks and national parks like Garden of the Gods, Mesa Verde, and the Grand Canyon. The furnace went out the night before we got to the Grand Canyon, and it got down to 17 degrees. I got up every hour for 10 minutes to heat the RV a bit using the propane stove, turned it on and off to rest, then did it again every hour that night. We went to Roswell, Las Vegas, then on to Malibu to see the ocean, and LA for a few days. Then we headed up to Yellowstone and were blown away not only by the park itself, but the drive there from California, through Utah and Idaho, just so breathtakingly beautiful. If you've listened this far, you've come to the point of the story. After Yellowstone, we had to leave from the west entrance, since the other roads east and south hadn't opened yet. We drove up into Montana, and for some reason her brother insisted on getting off at I-90 to a 2-lane highway through the Crow and Northern Cheyenne reservations. He was perpetually driving like an hour ahead of us because his RV was faster, and he's a bit of a reckless dude. But we didn't want to be far from him in case we ran into engine trouble, so we didn't really have a choice but to follow him, even though I voiced much hesitation on taking a back road route in the dead of night through a reservation. So we find ourselves taking the ramp to Route 212, and had just gotten onto the Crow Reservation and stopped to gas up, and immediately things just feel odd. It's past 10 PM, and as I'm pumping gas, I'm hearing children running around and playing off in the dark, and cars keep driving up to us slowly, checking us out. I get back in and Melissa is already saying, "Get us out of here, it's creepy as hell." So I do. We haul off down 212 in pursuit of her idiotic brother. Alright, he did save our bacon in Colorado Springs, so maybe idiotic is too strong. And there is nothing out there. Inky black skies, long, desolate roads, sporadic groups of 4 or 5 houses every few miles. I'm acutely aware that we lost self-service as soon as we got on that highway, so I'm just praying that nothing goes wrong. I try to ignore the acute feeling that something is watching us. Her dogs start to whine in their cages. The feeling of unease has continued and I really don't want to stop, but Melissa said we need to let them out to poop or we'd be cleaning up a mess. I pull over next to a big field and she gets her oldest daughter Ariana and Isabella to leash them, and I throw open the doors to let them out. As soon as they hit the grass, the 2 German shepherds sight something in the darkness and start going absolutely mental. They're barking and straining against the leash, and the girls are struggling to control them. My blood pressure spikes, and I look over at Melissa, and she looks completely bewildered. And I reach up to the overhead compartment and pocket my handgun, which I brought for protection. We get the girls and the dogs back in the RV, and peel off down the highway again, cognizant of the fact that we're probably going to have to clean up crap, since they couldn't go outside. They're back in their cages and continue to whine. I drive on for another half hour or so and they're still whining, and Melissa says we really need to let them go outside again. This is the last thing I want to do, because this whole time I've had this feeling that something is watching us, and I'm just running through my head all the scary stories I've read about evil spirits, Wendigos, Skinwalkers and all that stuff. And I reason with myself that I'm just scaring myself and they probably just smelled foxes or coyotes or something. And I really didn't want to have to clean up dog poo from the inside of the cages on some forgotten highway using jugs of water in the dark. We pull over again, and this time I take my gun with me, and I walk outside with the girls as they take the dogs out. I distinctly remember thinking, I don't know what good a gun will do against evil spirits, but I'm not going down without a fight. The moment their paws hit the ground, they immediately start to howl and bark into the darkness. The hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I'm looking at Ariana, and she has this look of terror on her face. I say to the girls, get the dogs back in the RV. We're getting the hell out of here. But her dog Hazel is straining so hard at the leash, and she can't get her inside. So I pick up this German Shepherd in both arms and have to heave her through the door and run inside. As I lean out to pull the door closed, I think to myself, this is the moment where something with sharp claws grabs my arm and pulls me into the dark. Thankfully, as I'm here writing this today from my bedroom and not the belly of a skinwalker, this did not happen. The dogs go back to their cages and continue whining. I jump back in the driver's seat and gun it down the road, and Melissa leans over and says in a panicked whisper, "What's going on out here? Don't you feel it? Am I crazy or does something feel really wrong?" I glance at her and remember one of the big no-nos of Skinwalker lore. You don't talk about them. You don't even think of them if you can help it, because it draws their attention to you. I say, "No, you're not crazy, but I can't talk about it right now. I feel it too, but just trust me, we cannot talk about it now." As I'm cresting a small hill on the highway, I look over at her and say, "Just trust me, we'll talk about it later, okay? But we can't now." I look back ahead, and that's when I see it. This enormous white rabbit standing on its back legs in the middle of the road. Looking back now, with the benefit of a cool head, I'm sure it was just a bit bigger than normal, but I'm telling you at that moment it looked huge. It looked like it was 3'5". I swerve this 37-foot long RV around this beast of a hare, but thankfully keep control. I pull the pedal to the metal and say, "I'm sorry," if I don't care if the dogs have poo in their cages. I'm not stopping again. And I didn't, thankfully. And they didn't either. We made it to the town of Spearfish safely and stopped for the night. And after visiting Mount Rushmore the next day, we recounted the fear we all felt that night. And I told Melissa specifically why I don't want to talk about it. And she said, "Yeah, I knew why. I've read all kind of stuff about the Native American legends." And I realized later with a chuckle that maybe those spirits were real. Maybe they weren't, but if they were, they probably didn't appreciate me wearing my Cleveland Indians cap throughout their reservation.
Driving to the Grand Canyon with my mom in 2017, it was almost 2 a.m. and pitch black outside. To see other cars at this time of night, and where we were, was rare. But suddenly, a man that was dressed in Native American clothing showed up in our headlights on the side of the road. He was walking away from us, and I didn't say anything, neither did my mom. That is until about 2 miles down the road when we passed him again. I sat still for a few seconds before asking, "Did you see that?" And my mum's response? "I don't want to talk about it." Basically, we'd both seen the same man walking in the same direction, 2 miles apart. Same clothes and everything. No bags and nothing but the clothes on his back. I remember getting cold and suddenly being wide awake. Then we stopped 40 minutes later in the next town and slept in a seedy hotel.
I'm a motorcyclist and was driving my way down from my girlfriend's house. It's about a 20-minute ride, but it was 3 a.m. and the road goes through a forest without any streetlights. So I ride through the forest, already giving everything to my little 50cc dirt bike, when a naked mannequin is suddenly visible on the side of the road. I saw it appear in my headlights and drove by it doing 60 kilometers an hour. It was scary as hell. A mannequin standing there naked on the side of a dark road in a forest at 3 a.m. in the morning. Damn. I'm sure if any one of you would have passed it in the same situation, you'd have all got shivers too.
I accidentally took a wrong turn when trying to get to an on-ramp to I-30, and I found myself on a long, dark country road. It was foggy out, so I was taking it slow along this windy road, kind of enjoying the atmosphere, when I saw 2 red eyes reflecting in front of me. As I got close enough to make it out, it was the biggest fox I've ever seen, at about the size of a medium-sized dog. Its colour was a more vibrant red than I've ever seen too, so I came to a complete stop, and it stood there in front of me, staring for maybe 25 or 30 seconds before sauntering slowly away. It was majestic. Maybe it doesn't sound too creepy because it was just a fox, which isn't unusual at all. But the entire time I had chills and felt a sense that I was witnessing something special. I felt like I'd seen the king of the foxes or something.
When I was 19, I was driving around town with a friend sometime after midnight, talking crap and listening to music. We drive past this road with a signpost to an area neither of us have heard of, despite both living in this town our whole lives. I asked if she wanted to go see where the road went, and she said yes. So I pull a U-turn and off we go. It's a paved road, with heavy trees on each side and a few houses. Nothing unusual for either of us. I was living on a street like this at the time anyway. Within about 5 minutes, the conversation just kind of dies off, and a few minutes after that I start to get this uneasy feeling. Then we passed a kangaroo on the side of a road. It remained perfectly still, just turning its head to watch us drive past, and I got this distinct impression it was standing guard. After that, I just got more and more anxious. I ended up turning to my friend and saying, "This is gonna sound stupid, but can you..." She was already taking her seatbelt off. "I'll lock the back doors." We kept following the road even after that, because we were stubborn and didn't know when to admit defeat. It was at least half an hour. Besides, my 60-minute cassette tape had flipped twice over, 30 minutes of music on each side, between pulling on the paved roads and coming to a sign saying dirt road ahead. By this stage I felt physically sick and my skin was crawling. Without a word, I did the quickest 3-point turn I was able to and head back down the road. The closer we got to the turnoff, the better I felt, until we were back on the main road, where I felt like I could breathe easily again. We told a few people about it and got brushed off by most. We didn't even drive past that turnoff without flinching or shuddering for a few months. The feeling of dread had been that strong. Then about 6 months later, she turns to me out of nowhere and says, "Let's drive it during the day." So we went. My friend has both her phone and mine on her lap, with the emergency numbers punched in, and we're playing upbeat pop music trying to keep us calm. It took us less than 5 minutes to reach the dirt road, and on checking the odometer, the paved section was only 1 kilometer long. Once again, we got the hell out of there, and have never been back. No idea what the hell was going on that night, but I can say with certainty that we were not meant to be there. Even 20 years later, if someone mentions the area of the signpost, we shudder. And recently, I turned to her out of nowhere and said, "Hey, was that you with me on the road where..." "Yes, and I don't want to talk about it," she'll reply.
A few years back, I drove up the Pacific coast alone from California to Washington. A lot of people I talk to imagine that most of California looks like Venice Beach, but between the cities are gigantic, sparsely populated areas, and in some of them, if it's late enough, you won't pass another car for hours. So I'd been slowly making my way up and exploring different spots. And one night I was driving particularly late, trying to make some distance for the morning. I'd passed through the last town for a good distance and had a ways to go before the next. And at about 2 a.m. I was getting drowsy. About 100 miles from the next town. So I decided to start looking for a place to sleep. On Highway 1, you will pass people pulled over on the road, camping quite often, especially closer in towards the cities. But I was in the middle of nowhere and hadn't seen anyone in a long time. There was 0 foot traffic and 0 cars passing, so I decided I'd just pull off the road and sleep in my car. As I was looking for a good turnoff, I started passing through a curvy wooded area that I needed to slow down for. As I was coming around a turn at a decent pace, I saw a person's legs walking towards me in the dead center of the opposite lane. My first thought was it might be a transient making their way down the coast, but at 2 a.m. in the middle of the road. I slowed way down as to not accidentally hit them, as they were walking in complete pitch black with no light whatsoever. But as I came closer, and my headlights began to show more of the mysterious pedestrian, I could see he was wearing long khaki pants, a large duffel bag, a t-shirt, and this bizarre black mask. It looked like some strange high-tech gas mask. The best I can describe it is that he looked like Cabal from Mortal Kombat. By the time I could actually see him clearly, I was just a few feet from passing him at about 10 to 15 miles an hour. Now I'd been driving for hours at this point, with not another person in sight, and with no cell service, and I was just thinking, what on earth am I looking at? As I was approaching him, I had my driver's side window completely down, and I blurted out an expletive out of pure confusion. By this time he was just a few feet away, and he had heard me clear as day. His masked eyes snapped open to me looking at him, and I assume we made eye contact, but even with my headlights on him, the goggles of his mask were pitch black. They were just these 2 mirrored pits staring back at me for a couple of seconds until I'd passed by him. However, I looked back, and he had completely vanished. I downshifted and blasted off like a rocket, figuring that if he were a standard motorist, he most probably would have flagged me down, or said something as I'd passed. But he said nothing, just gave me this masked stare. I don't think he even would have looked up if I hadn't yelled out of the window. I tried to imagine what he was doing and what the mask was about. Was it some kind of night vision? I'd imagined he'd have turned away from my headlights blinding him. The area I was in was about 100 miles south of a military town, so maybe it was some exercise. But why would you be walking in the middle of the road and not even attempt to move? That's a death wish. I decided maybe another hour driving wasn't so bad, and I don't think I'll ever know what that strange encounter was about.
This happened in Sydney, about 2013. I was driving through a factory area early in the morning to get to the airport. It was still dark, and there were no other cars on the road, when we see a huge, tall figure just start to casually walk across the 4 lanes. As we drove closer, our lights shined on him, and he slowed down even more and just glared at us, and kept walking forward. My boyfriend yelled out loud as he rolled to an almost complete stop, and as my eyes focused on the man crossing the road, I noticed the swastika tattoo on his shoulder, among others. The combat boots, the camo pants, and his hands were balled into fists. It was bloody terrifying, and the way he confidently slowed down and turned to stare at us as we drove towards him. I honestly felt like we could have hit him with our car and we would have bounced off him. It took a good 5 minutes before we spoke about it. It was just so unsettling, and the first time it ever dawned on me that people like that lived in my city. I still feel extreme shock about this whole thing when I realized he was for real, and his confidence was terrifying. I got the feeling he could be a person that would cause extreme violence with no cause and continue on as if it had never even happened. I didn't think those people really existed near where I lived, outside of documentaries.
One night around midnight, and I was slowly driving down these tight, winding mountain roads in thick fog, trying my hardest to not crash into anything or drive off the side by mistake. When I came to a particular bend where the radio signal died for a few seconds, as I turned the knob and the radio filled with static, I saw what I think was a meth head point and laugh at me as I drove past him. It was more than surreal, like something out of a horror film. I kept on expecting to have some random accident and then see him standing there, pointing and laughing at me.
Last December, I went to a kayaking trip that was a 5-hour drive away from my place. I was invited by my friend to accompany his wife, so I left quite late, but I predicted I would get there around 8 p.m. The campsite itself wasn't that secluded. It was by the river, behind a little town, but to get there, I had to use a 2-lane expressway that goes through a forest reserve. It was around 7 p.m. when I reached the expressway, but what I did not expect was how winding and dark the road was. A few solar road lights and some signs of beware the animals passing here and there. I was driving alone and it was drizzling, but I wasn't too worried because the expressway was filled with cars going in the same direction as me. Because of that, the traffic was slower than the average speed. I have to admit I'm not a patient driver by any chances, so any chances I have to pass the cars in front of me until I get to this van at the end of the line. But I decide maybe I should just stay behind the van to be safe since the road was getting dark. Then we reached the passing line. The cars behind me started to pass us. The van maintained in slow speed. I counted and there were already 6 cars past us, so I ramped up and left the van. There was a right bend, and once I got through it, I was alone on the road. I waited for the cars behind me to come out from right behind the bend, but there was no one. I thought I was driving too fast, so I slowed down. Not even the van showed up. The passing lane ended, and now I was driving through a ravine. I saw a temporary signboard saying drive slow, and a few meters ahead another signboard saying landslide 100 meters ahead. What the hell? Is this road closed? But I didn't see any alternate route on the way, and there was no junction, so I drove as slow as it could be, and there was no landslide whatsoever, and still no sign of any vehicle on the road except mine. It was the most agonizing 10 minutes of my life, driving alone on a narrow, winding road in the middle of nowhere, just hills and trees all around me. No light, but my car lamp in front of me, and my phone screen. It was eerily silent. I put the volume of my car radio up, but I just didn't feel right. And it was so cold, with the air conditioning turned off too. I saw a welcome signboard at a left junction, turned left, and have never felt so relieved seeing random shop lots with people in them. I'm a truck driver. I was crossing Texas in the middle of the night. After a while I become white line mesmerized when I notice a few red lights slowly flashing ahead. Huh? Construction zone, I guess. Except, as I'm coming out of my self-imposed hypnosis, I slowly become aware that more and more red lights are there, on both sides of the highway, and they're all blinking at the same time. Fully awake now, I find myself trying to find the ends of the light, to the left or the right. I feel like Hammy in Over the Hedge. It never ends. It never ends that way too. I'm really beginning to freak out, but oh, wait. It was just a wind farm, and I'm an idiot. This happened to a friend of mine and her brother, who I also know. The car had 2 other people in the back seat, so it wasn't some sort of illusion or mind trick. They were driving down to Tennessee from Kansas. It was a very dark and lonely road, as told by my friend called Kate. They were doing between 60 and 65. 2 hours pass and there are no signs of life. It was 2 a.m. and suddenly they see a black dog running towards them with blood eyes, and they slam on the gas and go faster as they near the dog, when it just vanishes. 5 miles down the road, they saw the dog again with red eyes and they slam on the brakes and turn the other way. Till this day, they don't know what it was. The scary part was everyone saw it too. Kate, her brother, Jim, and the 2 friends in the back seat. They all saw the dog. They've speculated it could have been a bloodhound, but they don't know.
So I was driving home from work one night down a backcountry road, with cornfields on either side of me. I was taking my time that night because it was the same weekend as a local festival involving alcohol, so I expected some drunk idiots hanging around. Down the road about a quarter of a mile, I could see people coming out of the cornfield. on the right. And now, this being in the middle of nowhere, in the rural Midwest with no nearby buildings, I was rather confused by these people. As I got closer, I stopped in front of them, but was ready to peel out in case they tried to carjack me. At this point, about 50 guys had probably crossed the road in a single file, when the last guy, leading a coyote, walked across. He waved, then went back into the corn in the other side of the field. I still don't know what this was all about, but I assume it was just drunk guy things.
When I was driving this one time, I saw what I thought was the goat man of Merdy Mountain. I was driving home from work late one night at 11 p.m. The car overheats, so I have to pull into a lay-by in the middle of an empty mountain road to let it cool down for a bit. Slowly, I drive in when I see a white, translucent humanoid figure run in front of my headlights and disappear into the forest. I sat in my car for a half hour, crapping myself while I waited for it to cool down. It was the most bizarre experience of my life.
I wouldn't say this is unexplainable. The body just continued on. But it really is a WTF moment. A person had had an accident and they had been decapitated. Pure and simple. Their head had turned into mush across the ground, and their heart had been pushed up and out of their chest, laying outside and next to the body. Goodness knows what happened to their organs, but it was all still connected, pumping blood. And I was there looking at this horrific scene, wondering how on earth the body was pumping blood without a heart or a head. Be careful when riding a bicycle, guys.
I was going home from my girlfriend's apartment fairly late, between 12 and 1 a.m., when I noticed a man walking slowly on the driver's side. Given this is an old road with only 2 lanes, oncoming and going traffic, it freaked me out. I called my dad and he mentioned, usually when immigrants are tired and needing help, they show themselves and walk next to the highway. I called 911, and I hope they got the help they needed. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, please let me know. And a huge thanks again to Miss Fearsome for joining me in tonight's video. It really means a lot. And if you'd like to check out her work after hearing her narration, which, you know, why wouldn't you? She's really good. You can find the link on screen and in the description shortly. But thank you guys. Thank you for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed the video, like I said. If you did, you can check out another video here that's also about driving and road trips that you may like too. But that's it from me. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.